General Sebastian Goons's boot was inches from Min Jones-Gomes's face. Polished, immaculate, it reflected the gray sky of a country that had already forgotten the color of peace. Min was on his knees in the mud, his uniform soiled, his fingers tracing complex lines in the wet earth. The air smelled of rain and tension. Around them, a circle of officers watched in silence, impassive faces that couldn't quite hide their discomfort. "This," General Goonis said, his voice as sharp as broken glass, pointing with the toe of his boot at the drawing on the ground. "This is your grand strategy, Lieutenant Marine. Playing in the mud?" Lieutenant Raphael Lee Marine, standing beside him, swallowed hard. "Sir, it's an accurate representation of the terrain. More accurate than any map we have." Guns let out a short, humorless laugh. "A representation? Made by a man who can't even read his own name. A soldier who failed every written test, who can barely look a superior in the eye, and you want me to risk the lives of 200 men based on his scribbles?" Min didn't move. His eyes weren't on the general, nor on the other officers. They were fixed on his dirt map, a universe of valleys, rivers, and elevations that only he seemed to fully comprehend. To him, that patch of ground was clearer than any written word. There lay the truth of the world. The general saw a deficiency. The lieutenant saw hope. And Min just saw the path. "I don't know from what part of the world you're listening to me now, but know that what happened next changed the course of a war. If you want to understand how a man's greatest weakness became a nation's greatest strength, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on stories like this." Min Jones-Gomes's story didn't begin on that muddy battlefield, but in a quiet backyard, under the watchful gaze of his mother, Maria Wozniak. From a young age, Min was a universe apart. While other children ran and shouted, he would sit for hours, arranging pebbles in perfect rows, sorting leaves by shade of green, or observing the trails ants created in the garden. The world for him wasn't made of words but of patterns. Maria remembered with painful clarity the early years, the absence of speech, the panic at loud noises like a blender, the way he avoided touch, stiffening like a board if someone hugged him by surprise. Doctors used many words she barely understood. Developmental delay, difficulty with social interaction, spectrum, disorder. To Maria, they were just labels that didn't describe her son's essence. They didn't describe how his eyes would light up when he solved a complex puzzle in minutes, or how he could, at just 5 years old, draw an exact map of the neighborhood in the sand, with every house, every tree, every curve of the street. School was a battlefield long before the army. Letters danced on the page, taunting him. A wasn't a sound, it was just a shape, a triangle with a line in the middle. He couldn't connect the symbols to sounds, the words to meanings. Teachers with the best intentions tried different methods. Flashcards, songs, games. Nothing worked. Frustration grew within him, manifesting in quiet, crying fits, his hands covering his ears to block out a world that demanded something he couldn't give. He was labeled slow, uninterested, even stubborn. "He doesn't try," one report said. Maria read those words and her heart broke, because she saw the effort. She saw how exhausting it was for Min to simply exist in a world that didn't speak his language. While reading was an insurmountable wall, his visual world was astonishingly rich. He didn't need shopping lists. He remembered the exact arrangement of every item in the supermarket. If they traveled to a new city, he memorized it. Not the street names, but their geometry, the relationship between buildings, the location of a fountain or a statue. His memory was photographic, but not of static images. It was a spatial, three-dimensional memory. He could rotate landscapes in his mind, observe them from different angles, like a human drone. His father, a practical man of few words, struggled to connect with his son. He tried to teach him to fix an engine, to play ball. Min was interested in the engine's gears, how they fit together, but not in its function. He ignored the ball, more fascinated by the pattern the goalpost's shadow cast on the grass. The distance between father and son was an abyss of mutual misunderstanding, not for lack of love, but for a profound difference in how they perceived reality. When Min turned 18, military conscription became a shadow over the family. Maria was terrified. How would her son, who became deregulated by the sound of a siren, survive the shouts of a sergeant, the sound of gunfire. But his father, in an act of desperation and perhaps a crazy hope, saw the army as a last chance. The discipline will do him good, he told Maria, more to convince himself than her. The structure, the rules, maybe that's what he needs to get in line. It was a false hope, a thread of light in a dark tunnel, and everyone, deep down, knew it. But the alternative seemed worse, a future of isolation, without purpose, in a world that had no place for a young man who drew maps in the dust and couldn't read a book. So, with a heavy heart, Maria watched her son leave, a silent boy-man walking towards a world of noise, order, and words, the three greatest enemies of his inner peace. She prayed that the army would see what she saw, not what was lacking in Min, but what was extraordinary about him. It was a prayer that would take a long time and a war to be answered. Min's arrival at the training camp was like throwing a hothouse bird into a hailstorm. The reality of the army was a continuous sensory assault. The shrill whistles before dawn, the sergeant's shouts echoing through the yard, the cacophony of hundreds of men marching in unison, the smell of sweat and gun grease. For the other recruits, it was a challenge. For Min, it was torture. He spent his days in a fog of overload, his senses short-circuiting. His bunkmates, young men like Artem Scott Walker and Lucas Nakamura, didn't know what to make of him. Min didn't join in conversations, didn't laugh at jokes. He sat on his bunk, perfectly still, staring at a fixed point on the wall, as if solving an invisible equation. His boots were always the cleanest, his uniform the best folded. Order and routine were his only anchors. Artem, more impatient, nicknamed him Statue. Lucas, more observant, noticed the intelligence in his eyes, but didn't know how to reach it. Academic failure was immediate and total. Classes on military tactics, weapon manuals, communication codes. Everything was text-based. Min looked at the manuals and saw only a tangle of meaningless symbols. On tests, he handed in a blank sheet. He was punished for insubordination, for laziness, for disrespect. No, one could understand how a man could be so physically fit. He was strong, resilient, and had excellent aim, and yet so mentally slow. The officers saw him as an error in the system, a bureaucratic problem. They tried to assign him simple tasks, cleaning, cooking, supply room. But even there, he encountered difficulties. A verbal order with more than 2 steps got lost on the way from his ears to his brain. Get the ammo box from Depot 3, take it to Jeep 7, and have Corporal Pettit sign. The form. Min heard box, depot, Jeep. He went to the depot, got a box, found a Jeep. But which box? Which depot? Which Jeep? The form was forgotten. His superior's frustration was palpable. He was a puzzle no one had the patience to solve. His father's hope that the military structure would fix him crumbled to dust. The structure, in fact, was breaking him. Each day was a new humiliation, a new proof of his inadequacy. He withdrew even further. The only thing that brought him any comfort was the ground. In his few free moments, he would move away from others and with a twig or his finger draw maps of the training camp, of the nearby town he saw from afar, of the cloud formations in the sky. They were works of art of precision and complexity, born and dying in the dust, ignored by everyone. General Sebastian Gunz, who made periodic inspections of the base, noticed Min once. He saw a soldier scribbling on the ground and reprimanded him harshly for idleness and childish behavior. To Gunz, a man who personified military rigidity and efficiency, Min was the antithesis of a soldier. He was a defect, a stain on the perfect gear he strove to maintain. Gunz ordered that Min be kept away from any position of responsibility, effectively making him a ghost within the army, a body to fill a uniform. War broke out suddenly and violently. Min's regiment was among the first sent to the front lines, in a region of dense jungle and treacherous mountains. The hope that he would simply be forgotten in a safe corner evaporated. Now, his life, and the lives of others, depended on following orders he barely understood and navigating a world even more chaotic and noisy than the training camp. His family's false hope had turned into Maria's worst nightmare. Her vulnerable son was in the most dangerous place in the world, seen by everyone as a useless burden, dead weight on the verge of being discarded. The war, with its brutality, would be the ultimate. test for Min's silent world, and no one, absolutely no one, believed he could survive it. The conflict in the Kovar jungle was unlike anything the manuals described. It was a green, humid labyrinth, where official maps proved dangerously useless. Torrential rains changed river courses, landslides swallowed entire trails, and dense vegetation made compass navigation an exercise in guesswork. General Guns's troops were bogged down, suffering constant casualties from ambushes. The enemy knew that. Terrain like the back of their hand, Guns's soldiers were like blind men in a dark room. Frustration in the command post was a toxic cloud. General Guns raged, blaming the incompetence of his officers and the lack of discipline in the troops. He was a man of classical strategies, of clear front lines and pincer movements. This guerrilla warfare fought in the shadows of a terrain that refused to be mapped offended his military logic. He demanded more reconnaissance, more patrols, more data. But the data that returned was confused and contradictory. Patrols got lost or fell into traps. In this scenario of chaos and uncertainty, Lieutenant Raphael Lee Marin tried to keep his men alive. He was a young, pragmatic leader who trusted what he saw with his own eyes more than the yellowed maps from headquarters. It was during an exhausting break after a patrol that nearly ended in disaster that he truly noticed Min for the first time. The silent soldier was crouched in the corner of the makeshift camp, away from everyone, drawing in the dirt with a stick. Raphael approached, more out of curiosity than anything else. He expected to see a child's drawing, a meaningless scribble. What he saw left him frozen. Min wasn't scribbling. He was recreating with frightening accuracy the route the patrol had just taken. There was the bend in the river where they were almost spotted, the cluster of claw-shaped rocks where they paused, the clearing with the fallen tree that wasn't on any map and served as their shelter. He had even marked with small stones the locations where they saw enemy tracks. It was a living, tactile, perfect map. Raphael crouched beside him. "Min," he said, his voice low so as not to startle him. "What is this?" Min didn't reply with words. He just raised his eyes for a second, a flash of recognition, and then returned to his work, his finger tracing a new line, an alternative route they hadn't taken. Raphael's dilemma was immense. On one hand, protocol, the chain of command, military logic that said maps were made by cartographers and orders came from above. On the other, the undeniable evidence before his eyes. That soldier, deemed incapable, possessed a gift worth more than all the satellites and scouts. Trusting Min was an absurd risk to his career. It meant going against his superiors, against common sense, and betting everything on the ability of a man the military institution had discarded. He remembered General Gun's contempt for Min. Presenting this to the command would be professional suicide. Guns would ridicule him, perhaps even demote him for insubordination or for losing his mind under the pressure of combat. But the alternative was to continue seeing his men die because of bad maps and failed strategies. He looked at the tired faces of his soldiers, men like Artem and Lucas, who trusted him to get them home. Then, he looked again at Min's dirt map. The choice was between the safety of his career and the safety of their lives. At that moment, under the damp canopy of the Kovar jungle, Lieutenant Marin made the decision that would change everything. He chose to trust the broken soldier. The change wasn't a thunderclap, but a whisper. Raphael started small, a secret experiment. Instead of taking a paper map on his next reconnaissance patrol, he brought Min. He would describe the objective. "We need to find a safe passage to that hill's crest," using gestures and pointing to the terrain. Min would observe everything, his eyes absorbing the landscape with almost supernatural intensity. Then, he would find a clean patch of earth and draw the route. The first time they followed a dirt map, the tension in the platoon was palpable. Artem Scott Walker grumbled, calling it madness, but Raphael insisted. The path Min traced led them through a hidden ravine, avoiding a swampy area that, according to the official map, should have been firm ground. On the way back, they saw another patrol from a distance, bogged down up to their knees in that very swamp. The silence in the platoon was one of astonishment. Little by little, trust grew. Raphael brought Min a low wooden box and filled it with sand, creating a portable map table. It was a gesture of respect, a way to validate Min's work and make it more practical. Min reacted to this with a rare expression of something that looked like gratitude. His dedication deepened. He began using different elements to represent the terrain. Small stones for rock formations, twigs for dense forests, a blue thread pulled from a cloth to indicate rivers. His maps became three-dimensional models of impressive complexity. He didn't just map what he saw, but also what he deduced. He could read the terrain. A certain rock formation indicated the probable location of a water source. The flight pattern of birds could reveal the presence of a hidden enemy camp. It was an ancient, intuitive form of intelligence that modern technology had forgotten. Raphael's patrols became the safest and most efficient in the entire battalion. They found secure supply routes, identified enemy observation posts, and avoided ambushes with a frequency that bordered on miraculous. The silent turnaround happened when Raphael's unit managed to carry out a mission that was considered impossible, rescuing a reconnaissance team that was surrounded in enemy territory, without communication. All previous attempts, based on satellite maps, had failed. Raphael took his sand table to the planning tent and asked Min to plot an infiltration and extraction route. Min worked for an hour, in absolute silence, and at the end, presented a winding path through a system of caves and dry riverbeds that no one knew existed. The mission was an unqualified success. Everyone returned alive. The news could no longer be contained. Other lieutenants, desperate for results, began seeking out Raphael, asking to borrow his silent scout. Min's reputation began to spread, not as the broken soldier, but as the sand map man. The soldiers who had previously ignored or mocked him now watched him with a mixture of reverence and awe. Artem Scott Walker stopped calling him statue, and once even offered him his extra chocolate ration. Min didn't accept, but the gesture was an earthquake in the platoon's social dynamics. The turnaround wasn't an order from above. It was a revolution that began from below, in the mud and sand, driven by the need to survive. It was the silent validation of a gift that bloomed in the darkness of misunderstanding, watered by a single act of faith from an officer who dared to look beyond what was written on a piece of paper. The whisper was becoming an impossible-to-ignore noise, and it was rapidly climbing the chain of command, straight to General Sebastian Gunis's office. The moment of truth arrived on a rainy morning. General Guns convened an emergency meeting with all his field officers. The situation was critical. An enemy fortress atop the Serpent's Ridge was blocking the advance of the entire army. 2 direct assault attempts had resulted in catastrophic failures, with an unacceptable number of casualties. Morale was low, and pressure from high command was unbearable. It was in this tense atmosphere that Lieutenant Raphael Lee Marine stood up. "Sir, I believe I have a solution." All heads turned to him. Guns stared at him, his eyes cold. "Proceed, Lieutenant." Raphael explained his strategy, based on an approach. Route along the steepest and supposedly impassable face of the ridge, exploiting a geological fault that didn't appear on any map. "And how did you discover this miraculous route, Lieutenant?" Guns asked, skepticism dripping from every word. "Through Soldier Min Jones Gomez, sir," Raphael replied, his voice firm. A murmur ran through the tent. Guns frowned. "The soldier? Who doesn't read? Who doesn't speak?" "The same, sir." It was then that Guns ordered Min to be brought in, and the scene that opened this story unfolded. Min, on his knees in the mud, recreating the Serpent's Ridge with breathtaking accuracy, while the general publicly humiliated him. But this time, something was different. The other officers didn't just see a strange soldier. They saw the man whose intelligence had saved the lives of the men in their own units. The general's contempt now seemed out of place, a relic of a previous era, pressed by the reality of his failures and the silent confidence of the other. "Officers and Raphael," Guns relented, but with a condition. "Very well, Lieutenant Moran. You will have your men. You will follow your dirt map. But know this, if this mission fails, I will personally ensure your career ends in this very mud." The preparation for the assault was unlike any other. The planning center wasn't a room full of maps, but a large sand table where Min worked. He didn't give orders, but he showed the way. He used stones of different colors to represent the different platoons. He showed the blind spots of enemy sentries, the times when the fog was densest, the exact spots to fix climbing ropes. The platoon leaders, experienced and hardened men, clustered around, asking questions that Raphael translated into simple terms for Min. And Min responded, not with words, but by moving the stones, adjusting the contours of the sand. For the first time, his language was the lingua franca. The night of the assault was tense, as the troops moved in absolute silence. Following Min's impossible route, a small personal victory occurred in the camp. Lucas Nakamura, the soldier who had always observed Min with curiosity, approached him. He said nothing. He simply held out his hand and gave him a small, smooth stone of a very particular blue hue, which he had found. Min looked at the stone, then at Lucas, and took it. He placed it on his sand map, precisely at the spot representing the final objective, the heart of the enemy fortress. It was a gesture of camaraderie, a recognition that everyone at that moment spoke the same language. The battle for Serpent's Ridge was fierce, but brief. Guns' troops emerged where the enemy least expected them, like ghosts emerging from the rock. The surprise was total. The fortress fell in less than an hour. Casualties were minimal. It was the most decisive victory of the war up to that point, a turning point that broke the backbone of the enemy's resistance. At dawn, when news of the success reached the command post, General Goons remained silent for a long time, looking at Min's sand map, now with the small blue stone gleaming on top. He didn't apologize to Raphael. He didn't praise Min, but his next orders were the greatest victory of all. "See to it that Soldier Gomes has his own tent," he told his adjutant, "and get him all the sand he needs." The war wasn't over yet, but at that moment, the broken soldier, the man who drew in the dirt, had already won it. The fall of Serpent's Ridge changed the dynamics of the war, and it also changed Min Jones Gomes's life forever. The tent General Guns ordered wasn't just any tent. It was large, well lit, and housed an immense sand table with modeling tools and a supply of pebbles and twigs of all kinds. It became the new strategic heart of the army. High-ranking officers, who previously didn't even know of Min's existence, now lined up to consult him. They called him the Compass. He no longer participated in patrols. His job was planning. Before any major operation, commanders presented him with the objectives. Min would listen in silence, absorbing the information. Then, he would spend hours, sometimes days, hunched over his sand table, his hands moving with hypnotic grace, sculpting the battlefield. He didn't just create a map, he created a simulation. He showed the movements of enemy troops, anticipated counterattacks, revealed weaknesses in the defense that no intelligence analyst had perceived. General Gunes had to confront the depth of his misjudgment. He never apologized to Min directly. His pride wouldn't allow it, but his transformation was visible. He began to treat Min's work with almost religious seriousness. He coined an official term for it, kinesthetic topographical analysis. He defended Min's method before high command with a ferocity that surprised everyone. It was his form of penance. In a decoration ceremony, he pinned a specially created medal to Min's chest, not for bravery in combat, but for exceptional strategic contribution. During the ceremony, for the first time, the general looked Min in the eye and gave a slight nod. Min, as always, remained silent, but something in his posture relaxed. It was the recognition he never knew he needed. For Min, the change was overwhelming. The noise and chaos of war were replaced by the silence and concentration of his tent. He finally had a space where his brain could function without interference. People no longer demanded that he speak or read. They came to him seeking the only language he mastered, the language of the earth. He was no longer a burden. He was the army's most valuable asset. This new reality allowed him to connect with others in his own way. Lieutenant Raphael Lee Marine became his interpreter and friend, the only one who seemed to understand his long periods of silence and his needs. Lucas Nakamura visited him regularly, bringing him interesting objects he found: an exotic bird feather, a rock, crystal flower, which Min incorporated into his maps as symbols. Even Artem Scott Walker, the cynic, came to his tent, not to ask for advice, but just to observe, amazed, Min's mind at work. The most profound reflection, however, happened within Min himself. For the first time in his life, the way his brain worked wasn't a disability, but a gift. The tangle of patterns, shapes, and spatial relationships that filled his mind, which had previously isolated him, now saved lives. He began to see himself differently. The boy who felt broken, who hid from the world, discovered that the world, in fact, was just waiting to see things from his perspective. The war, with all its destruction, paradoxically, was what allowed him to build himself. He found his purpose not despite his autism, but because of it. His unique way of seeing the world wasn't wrong. It was just different. And in that damp, dangerous jungle, different was exactly what was needed to win. When the war finally ended, it was largely thanks to the strategies born on Min's sand table. The number of lives he saved was incalculable. He returned home not as the strange boy who left, but as a decorated war hero. The streets were adorned. There were parades and speeches. And for Min, all of that was, once again, deafening noise. At his homecoming party in his hometown, he felt as overwhelmed as he had on the first day of training. People wanted to shake his hand, hug him, ask him questions he couldn't answer. He retreated to a corner, hands in his pockets, his gaze lost. His mother, Maria Wozniak, watched the scene with a new understanding. Before, she would have worried, would have tried to force him to interact. Now she simply approached, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and said, "Let's go home." The pain of the past didn't magically disappear. Min was still autistic. The world was still, often, a noisy and confusing place for him. The difference is that now he had tools, and the world around him had a new perspective. The war didn't cure him. It revealed him. And it revealed to the world that disability is often just a matter of context. He received job offers from the highest echelons of government. They wanted him to become a permanent strategist, an intelligence analyst. He refused them all. The war had been a means to an end, a place where his gift was needed, but it wasn't his place. What he wanted was peace. Min found his purpose in work that for many would seem monotonous. He became a cartographer for the National Geological Survey. He spent his days on silent expeditions through remote mountains and valleys, or in his studio, creating maps of unparalleled beauty and precision. He didn't just use satellites and computers. He walked the earth, felt its undulations, and translated that feeling onto paper. His maps weren't just tools. They were portraits of the land, made by someone who understood it in its most fundamental language. His father, who once viewed his son with a mixture of love and disappointment, now watched him with quiet pride. One day, he entered Min's studio and saw him hunched over a giant map of a mountain range. He said nothing, just stood there, looking at the perfect lines, at the way Min had captured the soul of the landscape. He reached out and placed his hand on his son's shoulder. Min didn't stiffen. He stopped what he was doing, looked at his father's hand, and then back at the map. A circle of misunderstanding that had lasted a lifetime finally closed. The story of Min Jones-Gomes isn't about how war transforms a man. It's about how a man can transform war. It's a reminder that the quietest minds often harbor the most brilliant strategies, and that a person's true value isn't in their ability to conform, but in their courage to be authentically themselves. He didn't win the war with a gun in his hand, but with a universe in his mind, and the map to the path at his fingertips. The peace he helped win for his nation was, in the end, the same peace he finally found for himself. The loudest battles are often won by the quietest minds. Min's story teaches us that a person's value isn't always measured by the norms society imposes, but by the unique perspective they bring to the world. Sometimes, the map to victory isn't in manuals or on computer screens, but drawn in the dirt by a hand that understands the language we've all forgotten. If this story touched you, like, comment, and subscribe. Someone you know might need to hear that their difference isn't a weakness, but a superpower waiting for the right context to shine.